This video was something I've been thinking about for a while. As of right now, my biggest video to date is what if Ezekiel and Stacy swap seasons, even outperforming my randomized cast videos. Naturally, this, along with the fact that I think it turned out to be one of my better rewrites quality-wise, definitely inspired me to make another one of these types of character swap videos. Obviously, the possibilities are practically endless, and I've gotten a few requests on that front. However, there was another idea that no one really thought of before, and the more I explored it, the more it just made sense to me. Because these two actually have a lot in common. They're both redheads, they both got third in their debut seasons, both are sort of main characters in their debuts, both are in a relationship with a partner that has a sporadic or unpredictable personality that stems from some sort of mental disorder, both start off as very kind, timid, lonely, and feel unseen, and become more cutthroat and game savvy after their partner gets eliminated and shit gets down to the wire. And of course, both end up missing their chance to be in the final two because of an uncharacteristically selfless action that ends up being used against them shortly after. This got me wondering what would happen if they swapped seasons. Plus, I also wanted to experiment with the Disventure Camp character alongside a Total Drama one. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get started with a revenge what if first. To keep things simple, I'm not going to go through the trouble of inserting Ellie into the team-making order, since I have no real idea when Ellie would cross the finish line and who she'd get there before or after. Instead, she's just going to take Zoey's place and the teams remain the same otherwise. However, right from the jump, this already creates a pretty significant change. And that is that Vito would replace Mike as the most dominant personality. The reason I think this is the case is because Mike's plot is basically built on his relationship with Zoey. And it's shown throughout the show that Mike's personality trigger is literally to save Zoey, which strongly implies that his purpose is literally to save and be with her. And because Zoey is no longer here, that means Mike doesn't really have a purpose. And because Anne Maria is still here and she and Vito are mutually into each other, he would now be the main personality. This of course doesn't mean the other personalities, including Mike, don't exist, but because Vito only really needs to be shirtless to be out and Mike has no reason to passionately fight for his position as CEO of the Brain during the course of the season, it'd mainly be Vito, who would of course be by Anne Maria's side, basically from the get-go. Anyway, besides that, the first couple episodes really don't change all that much. The rats still lose the log race, Stacy gets booted for non-stop yapping. I don't really think Ellie would need to admit anything embarrassing during the Truth or Shark thing, since everyone bailed on the challenge early, nor would her involvement in the Fuzzy Glasses course change the outcome of Cameron's RNG making the rats lose. And like in the original, they still vote Dakota off for being useless and vain. For episode 3, Joe still thumb wrestles Brick for title of team leader, and Ellie has no reason to challenge Joe for that title. The rats still lose, and Scott still frames B for sabotage. Between Joe and Brick and Vito and Anne Maria kind of bouncing off each other, the only person I could kind of see Ellie getting along with is Cameron, and even then I think she would only really tolerate him more than the others, and that's where that ends. Episode 4 is where things start to change a bit, because I actually think this is where Ellie and Dawn would start to interact a bit more. While they are on different teams, Ellie has no issue seeing Gabby under similar circumstances, someone who is also very strange, had a passion for animals and wildlife, and seemed to appeal to Ellie for having heart and genuine intentions that she could see behind the weirdness. And by this point, Joe's bossy attitude would really start to piss Ellie off, and the others definitely aren't helping either. So at this point, I think she'd just have enough and wander off on her own, which obviously means Izzy finds her really fast. But Dawn was also the first one taken on her team, so she and Ellie would now have a lot more time to catch up. Dawn would reveal her aura reading and explain how she knows how alone Ellie feels and how stressed she is about how much her economic status is weighing down on her. Hence why Dawn's very blunt and nature-esque attitude stands out as refreshing to her. I think Ellie wouldn't mind this analysis and even respect this sort of bluntness the same way she does for Gabby, and because she would already know about this, Ellie would ask Dawn why she can't use her animal whispering on the spider. But she points out she felt a human presence inside the spider, though she doesn't know who it is until the end. Just about everything else plays out the same, except Vito gets more screen time and just makes out with Anne Maria longer, and Brick still gets gaslit out of following his code, losing the challenge. Now, in the original, Brick is ready to quit because he feels he failed his No Man Left Behind code, but now that Ellie willingly rejected that code from the very beginning, long before Joe convinced him not to follow it, he would now vote for Ellie instead of himself. And I think she would also get Joe, Vito, and Anne Maria's votes as well. Most people wouldn't like Joe, but they know she's valuable as a strong leader. And considering Ellie has basically no positive relationships with anyone on her team, Joe and Brick could both agree to convince Vito and Anne Maria to vote for Ellie. While Cameron and Ellie probably both vote for one of the Jersey couple for being obnoxiously obsessed with each other, but that still leaves Ellie with the most votes. However, this episode is not an elimination, but instead a team swap, meaning Ellie is now on the Rats, and Dakota still gets hurled again. Ellie would be really happy that she gets to be away from her old team and can now be on the same one as Dawn. For the first part of the challenge, Joe now pumps for Brick and Lightning pumps for Ellie, wanting to prove her worth to her new team after nearly being voted off last episode. Zoey isn't here to accidentally stand on the water pump, so the maggots never get the accidental boost to launch them to the skis. But given that Ellie's greatest fear is sharks and now she'd have to stare down a mutated one, I don't think she'd get very far. So without as many shenanigans, Brick should still be able to win it. This gives the maggots the speedboat and the rats the dinghy. And from here, the challenge basically plays out the same, the only difference being that Ellie and Dawn would both be near each other, both observing Scott and starting to grow distrustful of him. So anyway, the rats still lose and Dawn still has the confessional announcing she plans on exposing Scott, which he overhears and starts to plan her downfall. The problem with that is that this time, Ellie would also be close by since she's friends with Dawn and would have already been suspicious that Scott is up to something, and sure enough, she finds him red-handed with the bag of stolen goods. Scott tries playing dumb, but it doesn't work, and after that he admits she caught him, but threatens to pin it on Dawn anyway, and cites B as evidence that he's done this sort of thing before, and he'll do it again. However, Ellie points out that even without evidence, Dawn is already going to vote for him with her, and at this point it's his word against theirs, and they only need one extra vote to eliminate him, whereas Scott needs 2. And Ellie asks him if that's a risk he wants to take. Scott admits she brings up a decent point, and after a confessional saying he's got to respect Ellie standing up to him, he decides to come up with a compromise. Blame someone else and keep both her and Dawn in the clear, but Ellie has to keep his dirty little secret from everyone, including Dawn. Ellie refuses at first, but Scott points out even with the numbers disadvantage, he's basically controlled the votes for his entire team since episode 1, and if push comes to shove, he will pull the trigger again. And we've seen Ellie as willing to lie and work with nefarious people in Disventure Camp, so she and Scott would shake on it. As for who the bag gets pinned on, it makes more sense to choose Sam over Lightning, since Lightning is really dumb and also a much stronger player, whereas Sam is a much easier sell, since Dawn is going to believe Ellie over him and Lightning already doesn't really like or respect Sam, as shown in a few moments here and there in the season. So after Scott pins the bag of stolen goods on Sam, he's voted out 4-1. Dawn would feel relieved as she hugs Ellie, saying she's glad that problem is over with, and Ellie faintly agreeing with a frown on her face looking at Scott's shit-eating grin by the campfire. Interestingly enough, Scott doesn't actually throw this challenge, and without Zoey to dress up the maggot, Anne Maria and Brick would actually fight over who gets to do the design. Joe thinks the fight is stupid, while Vito obviously backs Anne Maria. So Joe and Cameron both insist Anne Maria take the lead, while Brick comes up with a backup plan. However, since Dawn is still here, that makes getting just about any animal sedated and to cooperate much easier for her team than in the original. And Ellie, having gone to art school and Disventure Camp, should have a decent enough taste in dressing it. I would say probably more tasteful than Anne Maria, especially since Lindsay is one of the judges, and even though they're not super similar, Lindsay's style is much closer to Ellie's than Anne Maria's. Chris is about to announce the rats the winner when Joe demands Brick initiate his backup plan, which is the explosive design bag, which makes the Yeti super angry, but Dawn should be able to calm it down before it steals Chris's jetpack, so the rats obviously still win. Ellie and Dawn are both happy about how good of a team they make, with Scott snarkily agreeing, saying, "Yep, you sure do." So as the maggots go to elimination, it obviously comes down to either Brick or Anne Maria, and I think Joe would be the deciding vote here because these two would obviously vote Brick, and these two would probably vote Anne Maria. A lot of people might say Joe would vote for Anne Maria over Brick since she respects Brick more, even despite her mockery of him, and that Joe would want to keep him around since he's obedient and easy to exploit. But the thing is, Joe doesn't really care about loyalty, she cares about usefulness. Not only did Brick blow today's challenge, but in this timeline, Anne Maria and Vito are kinda a package deal, and Joe would not want to risk losing Vito since he's a really strong player, and while she doesn't know about his MPD, she does know that Anne Maria brings out the most in him. Plus, she could always just use Cameron as her servant anyway, so she doesn't really need Brick that much anyway. So, in a 3-2 vote, Brick is eliminated. Brick feels betrayed and asks Joe why she did that to him, and she just tells him sometimes you gotta sacrifice the soldiers on the front lines for the greater good. After the vote, Chris still switches Scott and Joe since they both volunteer. Ellie would now be kinda conflicted because she obviously really dislikes Joe, but now that she has Dawn on her side, she's much less scared of Joe than Scott, since unlike him, Joe no longer has any leverage. Ellie would immediately poison the well and tell Dawn not to let Joe boss them around, and Joe would laugh at them, insisting the merge is coming soon, so the whole team business means nothing to her now anyway, aside from winning, of course. And Ellie's just like, well, at least we can agree on that. Joe and Lightning still make an alliance and split off from Dawn and Ellie in the cave, all of whom get kidnapped by Zeke, who also takes Anne-Maria, giving her the fake diamond. Vito would also be kidnapped by this point, but when he sees Zeke give her the diamond, the gesture enrages him to the point where he overpowers the Gophers, just long enough to run away with Anne-Maria and the diamond, while Dawn still soothes the Gophers for long enough to let everyone else escape, and also pacifies Zeke and brings him along with her to escape from the caves and get medical assistance for his brutal condition. Scott also still quite literally throws the challenge, and this time he actually has more reason to do it, since Ellie now being on the other team is someone he'd want to keep in, since, he has dirt on her. And because Brick isn't here to sacrifice the Rats' golden statue, they still hang on to it. That, and Scott wouldn't accidentally throw his statue into Anne-Maria's hair this time, since Vito would have punched a path for him and her to escape already, meaning the Rats actually win this time. As for the elimination, it doesn't actually matter because Anne-Maria still quits with the belief that her diamond is priceless, the difference this time being that Vito, having a similar level of vanity and similar lack of brains, decides to go with her. And they both just make out on the hurl of shame, so Chris doesn't even bother explaining the diamond is actually worthless, and just shrugs before eliminating both of them, only revealing the diamond was worthless afterwards and thinking it's really funny. And because two people got eliminated this episode yet again, like in the original, Chris decides to add Dakota back to the game. So everyone still gets knocked out by the mutant turkey, and Scott definitely has the immunity idol by now. Only this time he obviously doesn't show it to anyone since Zoey isn't here anymore. Considering Cameron launching his team with the squid was needed to win the first part of the challenge, and Dakotazoid was needed to forge a path through the thorn bush in the second, I think the maggots should be able to win here. So everyone still gets knocked out by the mutant turkey, and Scott definitely has the immunity idol by now, only this time he obviously doesn't show it to anyone anymore since Zoey isn't here. Scott would still be trying to throw, but because Dakotazoid is bloodlusted and distracted by Sam, he'd mainly have to interact directly with Cameron, who's smart enough to be suspicious of Scott, so he'd have to kinda hold back on the sabotage, so as to not give away his game. Things on the Rats are mostly the same, only with Ellie and Dawn meandering about and discussing the upcoming merge and how they plan to get through it. Out of everyone left, Cameron seems like the only viable option for an ally, so they might be planning on doing that soon, but otherwise, yeah, they still lose here. Joe and Lightning would still be in an alliance like in the original, meaning a 2-2 tie seems imminent, which is not great when going up against Joe or Lightning, who are both much physically stronger than Ellie or Dawn in a tiebreaker. No matter how you slice it, they're in trouble, and as much as Ellie doesn't like it, she tells Dawn the best course of action is to talk to Scott to help save them. Ellie comes to Scott asking for help, playing off the fact that she's keeping up his good guy facade and that this is a necessary thing to do for her to keep that up. Scott agrees to keep Ellie and her precious little nature girl safe, but of course Scott wants something in return. Basically, the deal is, Scott gives Ellie the fake immunity idol he carved out a few episodes ago, without mentioning the real one, and tells her to show it to Lightning to get him to flip on Joe, since he's really dumb and won't be able to tell it's a fake. But, in return, Ellie must admit to pinning the stolen belongings on Sam and act as if it was her idea from the jump, essentially alleviating Scott from the secret and splitting her and Dawn apart in the process. Ellie tells Scott no way, but Scott points out she doesn't have a choice, and laughs at her saying she danced with the devil and now she's paying the price. So of course she goes through with it and the plan works, meaning that Joe is eliminated 3-1, but Ellie can't bring herself to do what Scott said, which is something that he plans on taking advantage of tomorrow. And this is the merge. So now, basically, instead of Scott blackmailing Mike over his MPD, he blackmails Ellie, threatening to blame her for everything unless she does exactly what he says from now on. It's pretty similar to the original, only now with Ellie in Mike's position and Dawn in Zoey's. While Cameron and Lightning get caught and imprisoned by Chef, and Dakotazoid just goes off on her own. Without Sam there, she'd still be heartbroken without him, so she wouldn't really be able to do the challenge effectively, while Scott would still force Ellie to tow him to each totem, and Lightning breaks himself and Cameron out of jail, and he still gets Fang to drive them both to Mount Chrismore, which Chef and Duncan still deface and destroy. Once Ellie snaps at Scott and has enough, she tells him to fuck off, but he knocks her over before she can stop him from attacking the last totem, and then tells Dawn that Ellie was guilty of everything. Ellie then explains to Dawn what really happened, and because Dawn seems like a patient person and can also read her aura, she'd probably be able to tell that Scott isn't telling the complete truth, but she also can't trust Ellie as a friend anymore for doing the things that she really did do, aka agreeing to let Scott frame Sam and, that stuff. Because Dawn is someone she genuinely cares about, Ellie would try to get her approval, but it wouldn't work. And after that, Ellie would insist she did what she had to do to save Dawn, albeit in a less cruel way than with Jake and Cannon. But Dawn retorts back saying she'd rather the universe take its course even if it means her getting booted, instead of all this corruption and betrayal. So anyway, Scott still wins immunity, and because he can no longer string her along, he eliminates Ellie, who leaves on a sort of weird note with Dawn. I think Dawn wouldn't tell her she's dead to her after this, but she's still not quite there to forgive her. But either way, Dawn still at least agrees to kicking Scott's ass after Ellie tells him to do so now that she knows he's a crook. Because of last episode and Joe no longer getting in between the two of them, Lightning and Cameron would now form an unlikely friendship, as Cameron would help Lightning build his helicopter before Joe accidentally pushes him into the building, before Joe makes him do her vehicle first, giving Lightning the smoke machine advantage. And Lightning agrees to cover Cameron, who still has his vehicle, in exchange since Lightning loves being on the front lines anyway. Dawn gets the bird Zoey originally got and has the same back and forth with Scott, while Dakota Zoid gets Joe's hot air balloon, which obviously goes nowhere, sending her into a fit of rage. Dawn notices this and has a confessional saying she feels selfish for letting her beef with Scott distract her from helping Dakota, which is far more important since she's a tortured soul who should be cared for. Because Dakota Zoid obviously doesn't fit on the bird, Dawn basically gives up the challenge after Heather still steals the blimp. That still has the money and Gemmy awards on it, and Dawn goes to comfort Dakota Zoid as they both head up a mountain. Meanwhile, Scott still has to suffer with a bird, which is no match for Lightning's helicopter, now enhanced by Cameron's designs, not to mention they have the smoke machine. Heather's Gemmy projectiles wouldn't do as much now that Cameron built a shield around Lightning's helicopter, and now they would both just drop into the blimp from both sides. Heather beats Cameron with the case with ease, but Lightning tackles her from the other side, still causing the blimp to descend as they press against the steering wheel with no one driving. Meanwhile, Dakota Zoid would vent her emotions to Dawn about how she really just wants to be with Sam, but has no way of reaching him. Dawn tells her the universe has a way of working itself out, and just then they see the blimp headed in a decline, presenting a perfect opportunity for Dakota to jump down and join in on the action. As she does this, she literally falls through the blimp and causes it to crash almost instantly. And given the sheer velocity the crash happened at as the blimp was going down, the prize money would get launched all the way to the other side of the mountain and lands perfectly in Dawn's hands, giving her immunity. After the challenge, Scott approaches Dawn congratulating her for the win, but she tells him to save it because there's no way he can save himself tonight, and that she has more important things to worry about, like Dakota Zoid's condition. This gives Scott the idea to tell Dawn that he'll help her find a cure if she votes with him tonight. But when Dawn says that's not enough for her to trust him, Scott also shows her he has the immunity idol, and says, "Would such an untrustworthy guy show you this?" And then says, "Yeah, that's what I thought," walking away as Dawn is left speechless. Dawn asks Cameron if he can help make a cure for Dakota Zoid, and since he was able to reverse engineer toxic waste into an Iron Man suit and edible quiche, I think he should be able to find a slow but effective cure for Dakota too, which they give her tonight. And because of this cure, they also vote for Scott after Dawn tells them about the immunity idol, and because Cameron is banking on Dakota being demutified. So Scott gets everyone else's votes, but of course he has the idol which he uses, and I think he sends Cameron home, since he wanted to make an alliance with Lightning next episode, and he plans on using Dawn, hoping to get her trust and take her to the finale. Whereas Cameron is way too smart for his own good, as demonstrated in episode 8, and also because in this timeline, Cameron never reveals Mike's MPD, and despite her immense size, Scott never really showed any fear towards Dakota Zoid. If anything, it seemed like he was happy she was there as like a nice distraction. Scott and Dawn still try to get Lightning's attention while he's ballin', which doesn't work, and Chris would still get trapped in the outhouse. By this point, Dakota would be reverting back to her normal self, which is still a klutz who has no idea how to cook. Dawn still makes the same thing as Zoey since she likes leaves and nature and stuff, and Scott and Lightning still make the same thing. Which means the only one with the stomach to eat whatever abomination they created is Dakota, because even though they found a cure for her, those mutant genes would still let her stomach all this gross stuff. So she wins the first part. But considering her body is already transforming and she just ate something awful, she wouldn't be able to get very far even without the tracking collar as she's in agony. So this takes her out of the running. As for the other three, Chef would be hunting down all of them and should have no problem catching them. But eventually, Dawn comes across and befriends some mutant animals, which Chef accidentally shoots, giving her and Scott enough time to escape as the animals attack Chef in retaliation. But Scott would push Dawn out of the way and go for the win, until Fang blocks his path yet again, and Dawn obviously doesn't help him this time, so she can easily win now. Since Lightning wasted too much time electrocuting himself, and Cameron wouldn't be there to make him stop doing that. Though he is still pissed since I imagine he still would have gotten pretty close, though it's not as visceral or personal as it was with Cameron. And at this point, I don't think Scott can save himself. Lightning was friends with Cameron, who Scott screwed over, and Dawn and Dakota are obviously voting for him too, leaning to Scott getting the same very painful elimination as in the original. For the final three, Dakota would be fully cured by this point, and she and Dawn would be working together. Unfortunately, they're both still missing a piece of the map, but luckily for them, Dakota still has some of her athleticism from being mutated, and Dawn still knows nature really well. But they still get to Larry around the same time as Lightning, who still, since Lightning can obviously cover way more ground. And when Lightning tries to yoink the flower, Larry still eats him and spits him out. Now, I don't think Dawn or Dakota are capable of pulling a Commando Zoey on this one, so the only chance they have is for Dawn to calm Larry down. But she would quickly learn that he needs the flower in order to stay calm, and would say, challenge or not, it's too cruel to take it from him. But Dakota would have a different opinion, as she still takes the flower anyway and still has Larry chase her down. And despite her previous mutation, she still wouldn't be fast enough to avoid getting eaten by him. Dawn would be really pissed at Dakota, but also doesn't want to get her eaten, not knowing what to do. Just then, Lightning body slams into Larry, making her spit out Dakota and the flower, yoinks it, and wins immunity. And between the two of them, Lightning decides to eliminate Dawn out of spite, and because even with her being more capable than she was at the beginning, Dakota is still significantly weaker than Lightning, and doesn't run the risk of... And there's also a scene with Lightning calling Dawn Creepy Girl, which doesn't necessarily mean that he's afraid of her, but I imagine that means that he still would be less off-put by Dakota and think he would have better odds against her than with Dawn. So in order to balance out the fight and make each alternate ending possible, I think Cameron would help Dakota build a pink Iron Man suit, and between that and finding a cure, Dakota would promise to give him a hefty sum of the money if she wins. But Dawn is still shunning her in the peanut gallery at the beginning, because, she's still mad about the whole Larry thing. Lightning basically does the same thing as in the original, extremely overconfident in everything, though this time around he is actually friends with Cameron, so I imagine Cameron would offer to help Lightning too, just to be fair, but he would insist he doesn't need it because of his ego. The two of them trade blows until the mutant animals come in, and Dakota would start dodging them instead of fighting them, since she has no reason to do so. Plus, she'd want to take a pacifist route to the animals to get Dawn back on her side. That is, until Chris accidentally unleashes all the mutants after the remote gets destroyed, and Dakota has to save Dawn and Ellie from a bunch of gophers. And once she does, Dawn realizes her pacifism isn't always the answer, and forgives Dakota for last episode. And after that, the battle ends pretty much the same way it does originally, only Dakota accidentally diverting power to the electromagnetic charge instead of doing it on purpose. And I guess Lightning still wins in the US and Dakota wins everywhere else because it's funny. In Lightning's ending, he keeps the money, and in Dakota, she splits it with her friends, namely Dawn and Cameron, and maybe also Ellie through Dawn. And Chris still ends up going to prison.
Hello! I like money!
So, I started a Patreon. I'm going to make a separate video solely on my new Patreon page and going into a bit more detail when I hopefully get a better grasp on it, but yeah. If you want to support me on there, I'd be super grateful. Basically, the way it works is there are two tiers. The first tier is the shoutout tier, where for $3 a month, you'll get a shoutout at the end of each of my videos. Pretty simple. The second tier is for those who pledge $10 a month, where in addition to shoutouts, you'll also get a chance to enter a raffle where you can give me an idea for a video, and whichever idea wins, I will turn into a video. This can be a total drama, Disventure Camp What If, for any character swap, timeline alteration, hell, even a custom-made cast and challenge list entirely if you want. Whatever it is you want, you name it. And once a winner is decided, the video should be out within the month or so. Bear in mind that depending on how many requests I get, I won't be able to get to all of them super quickly, but just because you don't win the first time doesn't mean your idea won't have another chance to shine in the next raffle. And if your idea does win, you're free to make another one at the beginning of the next month, which is when each raffle will be decided. I'm hoping I can get the hang of it relatively quickly and make this new system as efficient as possible for those who want to participate. And of course, I completely understand if most or even all of my viewers would prefer to just keep watching these videos and avoid the Patreon altogether, since I know it is a commitment. This isn't some big step in me doing this full time or anything. It's not. This entire channel is just a side gig. It's just a way for me to garner a bit of extra support for the channel and give a little extra incentive to both me and my viewers. I'm hoping to hit 1,000 subs soon too, and I'm not exactly sure what the milestone would be, but if the Patreon thing works out, maybe that'll influence what it ends up being. Who knows? Okay, enough of that. Now back to the second half of this video.
I was never book smart, but I'm money smart.
Just like with Ellie's Revenge of the Island, the first couple episodes wouldn't change all that much. One thing I think would be highlighted a bit more in this universe from the jump would be Zoey's loneliness and introvertedness, since without Mike or any real romantic match for her this season to accompany her, I think she would feel even more isolated than she did in Revenge. That said, Zoey is still much less polarizing than Gabby, so she and Fiore still swap teams after getting the most votes in episode 1. The alliance of 4 on Team Purple still remains the same, since Zoey is very introverted and wouldn't really mesh with Ashley and Lil's very extroverted nature, so there's no reason she would be introduced to or included in this alliance. That said, Fiore would still get pissed off at Will's cowardliness and play the victim, getting the majority to turn on him. I think Zoey would feel bad for Will, but I still think she votes for him since she has no reason to believe him over a child, especially since she's not in that alliance and would relate more to Fiore, who from her perspective appears to be an underdog and left out. So having Zoey, this challenge is interesting since we never actually learn her greatest fear, and in both Revenge and All-Stars, she always had an out from having her psychological and physical fears exploited. The closest thing we have is her fear of getting targeted by a jock in her audition tape, so the best I could come up with is having her stare down a football team rushing towards her without flinching, which this early on I doubt she could really pull off. But the purple team actually still wins this because her and Alec are the only ones who refused, which still leaves their team with one more point than Cian, who had 3 people refuse their fears. And because of that, I think Gret still tricks Tom into turning on Drew and getting him eliminated. I think at this point in the season, Gabby and Zoey would have talked enough times to at least start forming a friendship, since both feel isolated on opposing teams and have no one else to talk to, really. Gret would not approve of this since it threatens her stranglehold on Gabby. So I think Gret would realize Zoey thinks Gabby is strange despite her other positive feelings and try to exaggerate these qualities in order to insinuate that Zoey can't trust her. Something she would continue doing while they're stick dueling since Gret originally did so with Ellie. And Gret is still much stronger than Zoey at this point, especially with the dueling stick advantage, so the challenge outcome stays the same, with the CN team winning 3-2. And Fiore still gets Nick eliminated by having a wedge between him and the Alliance. I think Fiore's act would work on Zoey since Scott managed to do it despite his skeeviness, so Fiore could definitely convince Zoey the fire wasn't her fault, especially since Ashley and Lil have very different personalities from Zoey's anyway. Judging by Eat, Puke, and Be Wary, I don't think Zoey can outdo Jake and Miriam in cooking quality, especially since the gross ingredients factor still applies here. Beyond that, Gabby still volunteers for the role of single-handedly voting off another person, and Zoey now finds out about Fiore's notebook after Lil and Ashley expose her. Zoey would still want to talk to Gabby since Gret knocked her off the pier after talking to her, so poisoning the well with Gabby can only go so far. That, and in Revenge of the Island, we don't really see Zoey turn on her friends, as much as she just remains neutral until proven she should do otherwise. So she would still like Gabby and be wary of her due to Gret's influence. Anyway, I think Zoey would talk to Gabby and ask for her advice on how to handle her conflicting feelings now that she knows about Fiore's notebook, but also can't bring herself to align with the alliance that shunned her. And Gabby would probably tell Zoey to side with Fiore, since her alliance with Gret sort of parallels her willingness to work with immoral people in favor of having allyship. And she'd also really want revenge on her old team for voting her out in episode 1, which includes literally everyone except for Fiore, who was voted off the other team. However, the thing is, I think Zoey is someone who cares about kindness as a virtue more than Ellie, since she stuck up for Scott when he showed her his fake soft side until it was revealed to her as a facade, not to mention everything with Mal and All-Stars. Whereas Fiore is much more direct in her approach to playing the game, and at this point has a track record of sabotage, which Zoey would be afraid of happening to her next. So I think Zoey would agree to vote off Lil since she was kinda the unofficial leader of the alliance, but I also think she would trust Gabby to use her power to send Fiore out with her, in order to satisfy her moral code. And since Gabby knows Zoey is kinda already getting revenge for her anyway, I see no reason why she wouldn't go through with this. So, this means that Fiore and Lil are eliminated. And with both going through with it, Zoey and Gabby now fully trust each other and have a bond too strong for Gret to budge. So this episode is the one where each team faces off against themselves and one person from each wins immunity. And the challenge is to run from Jensen and his trank gun, and the first to ring a bell on the lake wins. Now, without Fiore, Alec would be alone, and once it's announced that they can't dodge elimination, he would immediately sprint for immunity without talking to his teammates. Which now means that Jensen would take him out in the kitchen without Fiore and Ellie to ambush him to prevent Jensen from doing so. Ashley would talk to Zoey, who would be off-put and apologetic at first for voting off Lil, but Ashley quickly tells Zoey she doesn't hold grudges and understands why she did what she did, and that they should team up against Alec this challenge. Zoey would be pleasantly surprised, and after the two both dodge Jensen in the woods, Ashley asks if Zoey has any game plans after today. And because Zoey has no reason not to trust Ashley, she would tell her about her friendship with Gabby on the other team, since their dwindling numbers could actually really use someone on the other side anyway. Everything on the CN team still stays the same, with Gabby winning immunity and severing ties with Gret, and Gret still getting the most votes. As for the purple team, with Alec knocked out of the challenge, it doesn't really matter whether Ashley or Zoey rings the bell. Both are obviously voting for Alec, but of course it's revealed that the two people voted off are actually just swapping teams. So Alec would now be on CN, and Gret would now be on purple. Now, obviously Gret would be in a lot of trouble here, since not only are Zoey and Ashley obviously closer to each other than her, but they're also both aligned with Gabby, who's now firmly against Gret, and Gabby would have made it very clear to her friends that Gret's the kind of person that would take a mile if given an inch. As since Fiore already rocked the boat, they wouldn't give Gret any leeway despite their usual kindness. So during the challenge, Gret is forced to ride the wheel while Zoey and Ashley use the trolley. And since I imagine Ashley has a lot of grip strength from the farm she grew up on, she would be able to go pretty fast. And while Gret would be angry and humiliated, Ashley flat out says she better shut up, since if they lose, it's pretty obvious who's going to get voted out. And Gret privately swears revenge. As far as Alec being on Team CN, now that he's been given a second chance, his first instinct would definitely be to make some new allies to keep himself safe. And his best bet on that front would definitely be Gabby, since Miriam and Dan wouldn't trust the newcomer like they didn't originally, and Jake and Tom are clearly involved in their own thing, and Alec wouldn't want to deal with that sort of drama. So Alec would essentially suck up to Gabby and ask her to save him and vote with him, and promises to do whatever she wants in exchange. Gabby gleefully accepts this deal since she hates people trying to control her, so naturally it makes sense that she'd love the opposite. Plus, she really wants to get rid of Gret once and for all, and having an extra person help make that happen certainly couldn't hurt. As for who wins the challenge, Gabby's terrible direction and Ashley's strength should be enough for Purple Team to win, as even with Alec's puzzle skills, he'd be blindfolded until they get all the pieces in the circle, which there's no guarantee would even happen before Purple Team wins anyway. So CN is sent to elimination, where Miriam and Dan both insist Gabby vote for Alec for quote-unquote breaking their win streak, but Gabby obviously refuses like she does in the original, but without the romantic interest in Ellie, she wouldn't use her totem to save Alec. Instead, Alec, being the observant guy he is, talks to Jake alongside Gabby, trying to get a read on him. And once Jake tells them about his conflicting feelings about Tom, Alec decides to harp on that and tell him that Tom can't be trusted with how mysterious he is, leading to Jake admitting what just happened with Tom shunning him and telling him he's a spy, which forges a clear path to them getting Jake to flip on Tom. So these three vote for Tom and these three vote for Alec. This triggers the same tiebreaker that happened in Disventure Camp All-Star, since Trevor said it had never been used before at that point, but obviously that changes now in this timeline. And considering Tom lost the exact same challenge to Gabby, I'm certain he'd lose to Alec as well, especially given Alec gave Gabby the tip to win that tiebreaker in the first place. So after losing the tiebreaker and getting eliminated, Tom asks how this could have happened and notices Jake turning away in shame and guilt. When he goes to ask him, Jake admits he voted for him and apologizes profusely with tears in his eyes. Tom nonchalantly replies, "Me too," before walking to the bus stop. Okay, and now we are at the merge. So now Gabby would introduce Alec into her now 4-person alliance. It'd be these 4. And be on an ego trip, as at this point she's letting her own demons start to dictate her decisions without even knowing it. Now hell-bent on knocking Gret out of the game. Zoey and Ashley would notice this change and be concerned about Gabby, but Alec is only focused on keeping his end of the bargain and doing what Gabby wants out of loyalty. Jake would be utterly distraught, and when Miriam goes to comfort him, he tells her what happened, leading to Miriam turning on Alec even more than she already did, saying she knew her instinct was right from the beginning about him being a problem. I guess Dan would still be allied with Miriam and Jake, even if he isn't as close to them as they are to each other. During the challenge, I think Alec tells Gabby to split the alliance into 2 to alleviate suspicion during the trivia. And the least obvious pairs would be Gabby and Zoey, and Alec and Ashley. So, liking that idea, that's what Gabby goes with. Ashley and Zoey admit it's a good plan, but are still very wary of both Alec and Gabby. Considering in the original the majority targeted each other and fell for the three-person alliance's secret plan, I see no reason a similar strategy still wouldn't work here. The only road bump is that Jake and Miriam immediately target Alec, so he's probably out first. But he also was shown to get every question right when he started trying, so he and either Ashley or Gabby could also take Jake and Miriam out in the process. Now, I have no real way of knowing how Zoey, Dan, and Ashley would do in this challenge, but I think it's safe to say Dan would get muscled out by the Alliance, and Gabby and Gret would still have beef, so they'd take each other out as well. So between Zoey and Ashley, I literally flipped a coin and it landed on Zoey winning immunity. And I mean, I think it's pretty obvious these four vote out Gret. Nobody else would have any way of knowing about the Mega Alliance until the votes are read out loud this episode, which still happens of course, but by that point it's too late. To be fair, I do think Ashley and Zoey would have second thoughts on cooperating with Gabby, since she seems to be losing herself now, but Alec would remind them they all owe her this favor. And wanting to be true to their word, they all vote for Gret, while Jake, Miriam, and Dan vote for Alec, and Gret obviously votes for Gabby out of spite. Gret angrily tells Gabby she hopes she's happy losing the only person that could have brought her to the end, and that it's only a matter of time before everything collapses for her. This would of course hold a lot of weight, since the Mega Alliance would now be revealed, and so would Gabby's unfiltered wrath, leaving Zoey and Ashley unsure what to do next. This episode is the one where everyone wakes up in the zombie apocalypse VR world, and because Tom isn't here, I think people would start dying a lot faster. Most notably with Dan, who would get eaten by zombies right away. The remaining crew would be focusing on how to survive, but eventually the dire setting allows Gabby's evil side to completely take over and ambush Miriam, who sacrifices herself to save Jake when Gabby shoots at them. And at this point, Ashley and Zoey would have enough and now completely turn on Gabby and Alec, and so this leads to Ashley shooting Alec, Gabby shooting Ashley, and Zoey narrowly killing Gabby right after. Who of course, still not knowing its virtual reality, would develop in-game PTSD with thinking she has the knowledge of having blood on her hands, slowly molding her into Commando Zoey, since Ashley is gone and time feels much longer in the VR world for some reason. Zoey would eventually find Jake hiding in a cave where he asks what happened to her, and she says she killed Gabby out of necessity, and the two have a long conversation about how fucked this whole thing is, how just when they were starting to trust people it all got ripped away from them. She fends off a horde of zombies and ultimately sacrifices herself to save Jake, thinking she has nothing to live for anymore, who now wins immunity for this challenge. Afterwards, everyone would be shocked to discover it was VR the whole time, and Zoey would be on the verge of tears and gives Ashley a long hug, telling her about the dark side that came out after she died, which she didn't even know existed, and how guilty she felt letting her and Miriam die in the VR world. And now knowing what Gabby is truly capable of, promised to both vote her off, along with Dan, Miriam, and Jake, since now all five of them are really scared of Gabby. Alec would tell Gabby he's worried about this elimination, knowing Zoey and Ashley aren't with them anymore. But Gabby assures him it's fine because in this timeline, Gabby still has the immunity totem, since she still would have picked it up in episode 2, and would never has told anyone, since I believe the only reason she told Ellie is because she had a crush on her. So she would have no reason to reveal it or use it on anyone else up to this point. So after Gabby uses the totem on herself, the only votes that matter are Gabby and Alex. And because they didn't see Commando Zoey firsthand in the VR world, they both assume Ashley is the biggest threat, so they would both vote her out. Zoey would start feeling even worse now that her closest friend is leaving, but Ashley tells her to keep fighting and to never let guilt get to her, since she tells her she knows what that's like and wouldn't want Zoey to experience that same anguish. After Zoey's sacrifice, Jake would now be good friends with her, and Miriam would want to recruit her to get rid of Gabby and Alec. Miriam gets a little aggravated after telling everyone Gabby should be their next target when Zoey hesitates a bit, clearly showing she still has a soft spot for Gabby, despite not saying it out loud and despite everything that's happened up to this point. For the challenge, it was shown whoever got to the bridge first grabs a note directing them to a spot where another immunity totem is buried. And even though the Commando Zoey persona would be dialed back a bit now, her athleticism would still get her there faster than any of the remaining players, since Tom isn't here. So she would now grab it on her own. Knowing they're outnumbered, Alec has a similar plan with Gabby that he did with Fiore in the original. Only now, instead of flipping Ellie, they plan to flip Dan, since they view him as the weakest link of the other alliance, having the same selling point of telling him that once he and Gabby are voted out, he's definitely going to go next. Since obviously Jake and Miriam are too close together and there's no way Zoey is going to be willing to work with them after everything. And Dan was willing to go with just about any plan that's the most optimal for him in the original, voting for Gabby and trying to vote for Ellie and everything, so he would agree to work with Alec and Gabby. So I think Gabby would now have 2 medals by the time Alec does, and when they insist Dan join them to avoid getting 4th place, he reluctantly agrees with the same terms Ellie had, which allows him to rack up the most medals and wins immunity. Now, unlike in the original, they don't really have an actual plan yet to avoid a tiebreaker. So after the challenge, Dan acts as a mole for Gabby and Alec and tells them their best bet is to further the divide between Miriam and Zoey, after hearing their argument firsthand over whether Gabby's a lost cause or not. Hearing this from Dan, Gabby would start to snap out of her cold-hearted persona a bit and be genuinely surprised and also a bit guilty after hearing Zoey still cares about her. But it's still not enough to change her mind about taking Alec's advice and having them vote out Zoey. From there, the plan is pretty simple. All Dan has to do is speak to Zoey and Miriam individually and lie to each of them saying he convinced the other to vote for the person they want. And because they trust Dan, there's no reason for this not to work. Miriam votes for Gabby, Zoey and Jake vote for Alec, and Gabby, Alec, and Dan vote for Zoey. But before Trevor can escort her off, Gabby stands up and says wait before apologizing to Zoey, admitting she was responsible for her elimination by explaining the whole plan that just happened. And this would be the straw that breaks the camel's back, with Zoey now fully embracing her commando persona and becoming royally pissed at Gabby, telling her to suck it as she unveils her immunity totem. And since Alec had the next most votes, he is eliminated instead, who is now also super pissed and tells Gabby she's got no one left by her side and is surely done for. Gabby ends the episode crying and miserable, Zoey fully commando, and everyone else shocked and kinda nervous. Gabby would try to apologize to Zoey repeatedly and beg her to be friends again, but Zoey shuns her until snapping into screaming at her to go away. And Jake tells Gabby it's just not worth it. Zoey angrily admits to Miriam she was right about Gabby the whole time, and even though she and Jake are put off by Zoey's intensity, the three of them agree to weed out Gabby, as well as Dan the traitor. During the challenge, Jake and Miriam split off together and end up with 2 flashlights and 0 batteries. Gabby and Dan both have 2 sets of batteries and 0 flashlights. And Zoey would end up fighting off a scorpion alone. Without Fiore here, Jake and Miriam are stuck in the dark. While after fighting off the scorpion, Zoey crosses paths with Dan after he escapes another scorpion, which Gabby distracts by literally talking to her own demons. Meaning that, Dan would go away from Gabby and then run into Zoey. With this, Zoey and Dan now have a light source, so they should be able to make it to the ladder before anyone else. But Zoey obviously pushes Dan off the platform as revenge for tricking her last episode, and wins immunity yet again. After the challenge, Gabby tries apologizing to Zoey again, and Zoey says if there's any chance for forgiveness, she has to vote herself tonight. Zoey then tells Jake and Miriam about their agreement with Gabby, and this prompts Jake and Zoey to both agree to vote for Dan. At first, Miriam objects, saying she thought they learned their lesson about Gabby, and that she can't be trusted, but Jake and Zoey both insist voting Dan is the smarter option, since Gabby seems to be willing to vote for herself, so she shouldn't be too hard to get rid of next episode. And plus, Dan is a lot more slippery and unpredictable. At least with Gabby, she wears who she is on her sleeve. And Miriam, having to admit Zoey's move was pretty badass, agrees to have the three of them vote out Dan. As for the other votes, Dan votes for Miriam, and I actually do think Gabby would go through with her deal after a long debate with her evil self. And this very selfless, albeit stupid act would move that evil self to the back of her head, where she can't bother her anymore, at least for now. Everyone would be shocked that Gabby actually kept her word, and Zoey's commando persona would start to crack. Gabby asks Zoey if she forgives her now after she voted for herself, and Zoey asks how she was able to go through with it. Gabby tells her that after what Alex said and everything that's happened since the merge, she realized she values her human connections more than the prize money, especially since she'd want to use the money to help the environment, but making more friends to help the trees could be an alternative, if less effective route in achieving that goal. Zoey holds her hands close to her heart, saying that's the sweetest thing she ever heard, and because Gabby would be completely earnest, the two hug and make up. Miriam sees this in the bushes and says in private she figured something like this was going to happen, but she's also glad it did, since if there were ever a time for Zoey's edge to be sanded off, the Final Four is a great time for that to happen. Miriam talks to Jake and tells him they have to make sure both of them make it to the Final Three. Jake agrees and says it shouldn't be too difficult with Zoey on their side, but Miriam tells him she's on Gabby's side again. Now, for the pairs going against each other, I used a random number generator since it was random in the original, and I ended up getting Zoey and Jake versus Gabby and Miriam. The challenge this episode is still the best of 5, and each challenge would remain the same. First is the cliff dive. We know that Zoey and Miriam can both land in the circle in the water, Miriam from this episode and Zoey in the first episode of All Stars. So it comes down to Jake versus Gabby. And without Miriam's help, we saw Jake's coordination was off in the archery challenge, so my best guess is that said lack of coordination would prevent him from getting in the goal. Gabby, on the other hand, should be able to do it no problem. I bet she's probably done something like this before because she's insane. So with it being 2-1, Gabby and Miriam win the first point. Next is Tug of War, and even though Miriam isn't weak, her upper body core and muscles are still at a severe disadvantage from her old age, so Jake and Zoey are going to win this. Then is the lunch break. During the lunch break, the score would be 1-1, and Miriam, knowing that Zoey is a bitch and a half to beat in a tiebreaker, wants to have Jake win immunity and bring her to the finale. But when she tells him this, Jake asks Miriam how they're going to convince Zoey to do the same thing. They decide for Jake to go over to Zoey and remind them about their pact to get rid of Gabby. And when Zoey tells him she's changed, Jake reminds her everything she did between shooting Miriam and Ashley, getting Ashley eliminated, being part of the reason why Dan was able to sabotage them, which almost got her eliminated, the list goes on. Jake tells Zoey that even if Gabby truly did change for the better, the competition truly brings out the worst in her, and she can't be in the finale if for no other reason than it being for her own good. And for the record, I do think Jake would genuinely believe this. I don't think he would just be telling Zoey this for, strategy or manipulation. Anyway, the next challenge is the campfire. Gabby should be able to win this one easily. I think it's safe to say she can light a fire long before anyone else here, even if Miriam doesn't help. Then there's the grease pole. Gabby tries to grab the flag leaping off Miriam's shoulders, but fails when Miriam shoves her off her. Jake gets the idea to wipe down the pole with his shirt, possibly from daydreaming about Tom, but we don't have to get into that, and gives Zoey a boost to grab the flag, making the score 2-2, which means the final challenge still determines which duo wins immunity. So for the longest pull-up challenge, Miriam still forfeits after a few seconds. And between the other three, from what I could find on each of them, Zoey appears to be the shortest, and given that the body proportions are somewhat similar between these three, I imagine that also means she weighs the least. And on top of that, she's also the most athletic of the bunch. So she should be able to outlast everyone else and win immunity for her and Jake. And Jake obviously takes Miriam to the finale, leaving the decision to Zoey. And after thinking about it for a bit, I do think Zoey would ultimately agree with Jake and tell Gabby that while she does forgive her and wants to be friends, she thinks it's unhealthy for her to continue the competition, since her demons could easily spring back up, especially during the round as intense as the finale. Now, it would be kinda difficult to say how Gabby would react to this, because I don't think she'd be super angry since she'd get where Zoey is coming from. But because she did also legitimately improve, I think it would make her more distant from Zoey, and she would tell her she understands why she picked Miriam over her, but she still needs some space, and after Gabby's awkward exit, Jake and Miriam both celebrate making the finale together, while Zoey starts second-guessing her decision. I'm not gonna go into the reasons why each person is rooting for who, since I'm too lazy to do that and this has already been a long video, but for one reason or another, this is what I got. I guess if you're really curious, you could ask me in the comments, I don't know. Anyway, for the helpers, Zoey chooses Ashley, Miriam chooses Tom, and Jake is left with Dan. Gabby has a conversation with Ashley apologizing for how she treated her, and Ashley forgives her since she's watched the show and has seen Gabby change for the better, but Gabby's clearly still feeling gloomy, and when Ashley asks why, Gabby tells her she just doesn't know how she and Zoey can trust each other in the future. She understands why she didn't bring her to the finale, but she just doesn't know where to go from here. Ashley and Will both reassure her that continuing to grow as a person and facing her feels like Will did will help her, and Gabby thanks them for the advice. Now, without Fiore's plans to sabotage anyone, the challenge becomes a lot more straightforward. Obviously, Jake and Miriam want to be in the final two, so Dan and Tom would help get both keys for each of them, which gives them a slight lead over Zoey. But she and Ashley still run a bit faster, so they're not too far behind. Then, everyone finds their maps and heads for the checkpoint. And since Jake obviously is going to be better at running than Miriam, he would cross the finish line first. And right when Zoey and Ashley are about to pass Miriam, she fakes a heart attack, and if it worked on Ellie, of course it's going to work on Zoey. Not to mention everyone else, including Tom and Jake. And so Miriam chucks Zoey's map away from the checkpoint and secures her spot in the final two. Zoey would be bummed out, and Gabby comes to comfort her, which she appreciates, and both of them and Ashley all hug it out as Zoey says she may not have won the money, but she found genuine friends, and that's more than she could have asked for. As for the final part of the challenge, I'm gonna be honest, it's just a friendly race at this point. Obviously, Jake and Miriam are splitting the money either way. Normally, Miriam faking a heart attack would put Jake on edge, but because it was literally for $1 million, I think he'd be able to look past it and just be glad she's okay. Anyway, Jake digs up the gas tank faster than Miriam, and because nobody sabotages the go-karts or switches the flags, Jake would pretty much just smooth sail to victory, and he and Miriam celebrate. I know, it's a pretty milquetoast ending, but hey, what are you gonna do? Sometimes it happens. After that, the deforestation bust still happened with Tom fighting Jensen on a bus, which flies off a cliff and ends with Tom saving himself and the money for Jake. When Tom hands the money to Jake, Jake tells him he doesn't know how to possibly thank him, and Tom says he can start by apologizing for voting him out after he thought he couldn't trust him. Jake says he's so sorry, and that he never should have judged Tom so harshly and prematurely, and that he knows he doesn't deserve to, but he'd love it if he could use some of that money to take Tom out sometime. But Tom pretty much says the same thing as in canon, saying they both need time to grow as people, and Jake says he understands and that he'll be waiting. So that was the video. Yeah, I know, quite a long one, and rest assured, once Disventure Camp All-Stars wraps up by the end of August, I definitely plan on making a part 2 with both All-Stars versions of these events. It was nice to finally do a what if on a Disventure Camp season instead of only the Total Drama ones. And yeah, I had a really fun time doing it. Next Total Drama video is definitely going to be Redonkulous Raced Randomized Cast. I've been putting that one off a long time since it's going to be an insane amount of characters, but I think I finally have a handle on figuring out how to scope that out after looking at it for a bit. Anyway, I'm a musical individual, and I'll see you then.